the beginning of a broader conversation. Today's panel will be followed up with another panel in the fall on economy, the labor market, housing, public health, and urban planning. So we'd love to hear from you on the topics you'd like to hear. We're all linked by the city itself at CUNY and our common mission of teaching and learning and researching in a diverse urban environment. And nothing has thrown our everyday into flux as much as COVID. And I know that I've confronted many of the issues that the panelists are raising today. So how this will work, we'll just have very short presentations, about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So let me introduce our first speaker, actually from our department, Michael Barnhart, and he'll be speaking on COVID-19's bioethical challenges. Michael Barnhart is professor of philosophy in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Political Science at Kingsborough Community College at CUNY. He's taught here for 28 years, and he has written and published widely on various topics, including the philosophical aspects of Buddhism, comparative ethics, bioethics, human rights, political liberalism, and some of his recent publications have appeared in the Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Ethics, which came out in 2018. So I'll hand the floor over to Michael. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to put my talk up through screen share, so let's hope this works. All right, can everybody see that? I hope. Yes? Okay, so I just start this. Okay, so I would just note, or you might want to note the email address, because I'm sure that, with philosophy, questions usually come after you reflect on it for a little bit. So I'm perfectly happy to answer questions that occur to you later. That's there, and I can go back whenever you want, or email it to you, or Megan can, I suppose. Let me just move my. I'm going to review. I mean, I know that the panel is New York City centric, but I'm basically the issues involved here, at least from a bioethical standpoint, are more or less universal in scope. So there's no particular New York City focus to this, but certainly these issues have cropped up both in the city and elsewhere. But in reviewing the literature and sort of monitoring things over the course of the pandemic, certainly a pandemic, any kind of health emergency stimulates a lot of bioethical discussion. So much that it's really been impossible to keep track of all of it. The things that I've seen percolate up to the surface generally fall into four basic areas, four basic categories. And so I put those up. They are conflicts between public goods and private choices, the tendency of the pandemic and our response to it to worsen social inequities between groups of people, a great deal of tension in the health provider-patient relationship. And by health provider, I mean everything from large organizations like hospitals or health networks down to people who provide direct care to patients, physicians, nurses, techs, and so forth. And then finally, a whole raft of questions and debates concerning the proper balance of public goods, because especially in a pandemic situation or an emergency situation, it's often very difficult to do everything. So let me address each of these in turn. I'll start with the conflicts between public goods and private choices. Essentially, the public good in question here generally is that of public health and the protection of public health. Private choices, by that I mean exercises of personal liberty or personal autonomy. And we've seen quite a number of these issues arise. I give a couple examples below, vaccine refusal being one of them. We know about the vaccine hesitant and those who are outright refusing to vaccinate for various reasons. Those are obviously personal choices. There are choices that are actually legal given the FDA authorization, emergency use authorization around the vaccines. However, they pose, I think, significant ethical challenges because of the impact on public health, obviously, if you don't vaccinate the entire population. The other examples, I think, which people would be very familiar with are things like medical mandates, mask wearing, social distancing, that kind of thing, and also lockdowns and so forth. These are obviously things that we experienced in the city, but it's also, an issue worldwide and in different countries, and different countries have responded differently. So that's one area of concern. Secondly, the second thing, the worsening of social inequities, really this involves the exacerbation of social inequities that we're quite familiar with in particularly the delivery of medical care. So it's been very well noted, especially in the press, more responsible press maybe, the disparate impact that the virus has had on disadvantaged communities. They've suffered higher rates of COVID-19 and higher rates of morbidity and mortality associated with the virus for various reasons. The other big issue, which there's been a great deal of debate over, is what's the proper way to provide access to the vaccinations, especially as, we had not enough doses to vaccinate everybody all at once. So it had to be dribbled out according to various rationing rules. The other big issue, of course, is the international issue where rich countries essentially have been able to, divert tremendous amounts of vaccine to the protection of their populations to the detriment of poorer countries. And then there have been all sorts of discriminatory and racist elements to this. I give one example, which is, has been noted rather widely, particularly recently, and that's the rise of anti-Asian bias incidents, some of these very serious, and not just in the US, they certainly in New York City too, but I mean in the country as a whole, and I mean the international community as a whole. Of course, the mistaken attempt to blame China and then to associate anybody who's Asian with China. So that's one set. The next third set is tensions in the provider-patient relationship. Very early on, we saw this particularly with regard to the allocation, the rationing of various important medical services, especially medical equipment that was in short supply for various reasons. That's anything from personal protective equipment to ventilators to then vaccines, and how to ration these fairly and in a way that doesn't discriminate is a major issue. Doctor obligations to inform and advise patients. Here I'm talking about issues that have arisen in the doctor-patient relationship, particularly where doctors have really been on the front lines and trying to inform patients and get them to vaccinate, to use masks, to practice, good public health measures. Often patients are resistant to this. I've seen this actually up close and personally. My daughter-in-law is a pediatrician, and the tension of dealing with her patients and trying to mitigate their concerns over vaccines and things like that has definitely worn her down and worn down the practice that she's a part of. The other things I mentioned there, providing care to uninsured and underinsured patients. This is a major issue still, even though COVID is supposed to be covered, COVID costs are supposed to be covered here in the US, still getting insurance companies and hospitals, so forth, particularly hospitals, billing patients when they're not supposed to. So, you know, the issues that an uninsured or underinsured patient faces continue and are particularly particularly serious in a pandemic-like situation. And then there's again, this is a big problem in terms of the actual interaction between, you know, those who provide healthcare and patients in managing people's perceptions, dealing with their uncertainties, and the medical uncertainties associated with things like the vaccines and so forth. And so anyhow, so I don't run out of time, let me go on to my last category here, which involves the problems balancing public goods. There's been a great deal of discussion over what goes into this. You know, what I have in mind here, of course, you know, public health is a major public good, but it's not the only public good that's out there. Obviously, having people employed in a healthy economy is an important public good. You know, that requires many moving parts, including having kids in schools or, you know, otherwise taken care of when parents are working and so forth. Obviously, it's been impossible to do all these things, especially in the context of a pandemic such as this one, which is where the disease is so communicable. So, you know, I think people are very familiar with a lot of these large discussions. Different countries, of course, made different choices here. You know, Sweden, for example, decided to try to protect the vulnerable, but leave the country open. Of course, they suffered a disproportionate death rate, as opposed to other countries, even neighboring countries, who took a very opposite tack and, you know, elected to lock down their countries much more severely. And, you know, we also saw and are seeing continued discussions about the importance of not just dealing with one aspect of public health, for example, combating disease, but also other aspects of public health, for example, lowering depression rates or the suicide rate, things like that, which obviously are adversely affected in a situation like this. So those are the four areas. As I said, they're probably not exhaustive, and I don't mean by putting them in the order that I did that they follow any particular rank order. But those are the ones that have leaped to the fore for me. I would just add, I know this is kind of a wishy-washy conclusion, probably in many people's view, but you know, these are issues which they're normative issues. They require normative deliberation, and they really are very resistant to any kind of large-scale legal or legislative action to deal with. They're the kind of things that take place at all different levels, institutional, personal, and so forth, where people are called upon to make decisions. So, but these decisions, I think, are collectively very important, because what happens to the pandemic, you know, how will it end? And, you know, in what kind of complexion it will have. Is it a kind of ongoing thing like the flu that we deal with every season, or is it something that is a you know, more serious threat? A lot of this will depend, I think, on the way in which we resolve a lot of these issues and their you know, and their eventual disposition. So I think that's 10 minutes, probably a little bit more.
Great.
And so I'll turn it over to the rest.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. So our next speaker is Sonya Abrego, who is visiting assistant professor at Fordham, FIT, and Parsons. Sonya holds a PhD in design history and material culture studies from the Bard Graduate Center in New York. And her research interests include 20th century dress, American cultural history, film, and material culture. And she's presently finishing a book called Western Wear, Post-War American Fashion and Culture, that you can look for from Bloomsbury Academic. And you can also find Sonya on Instagram. So let me turn over the floor to her. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm gonna share my screen, one moment. Okay, I just to view it, I can't. All right. Thank you for the introduction, Megan. So I am not a fashion forecaster, but I am trained to see things through the lens of history. So today I thought I would share some observations on fashion during and right now, right after COVID, and maybe suggest some directions to explore in the future. So to start, I'd like to share a couple of inventive presentations from 2020. So this is a video clip, and I'm just going to skip ahead to miss over the introduction for a moment. The introduction's cool, but we don't need it. So only the most affluent brands with the resources to create well-produced fashion films and pivot to online presentations were really able to adapt to the change, even though sales were still suffering. Nevertheless, some of the results, like what you're seeing here, Machino Spring Summer 2021, called No Strings Attached, where Jeremy Scott's creations were reproduced in miniature and walked down the runway on marionettes. And the guests that you see there included famous attendees at fashion shows like Anna Wintour and Edward Enninful. And the show was celebrated for its playful COVID-safe styling. Similarly, at Dior, designer Maria Grazia Chiuri presented the couture collection on a series of miniature dress forms. These gowns nestled in a little trunk that were sent to top couture clients, and there was an accompanying fashion film featuring the life-size garments in a very kind of surrealist landscape. And the connections to surrealism, particularly with the interest in the doll and the dress form, were really extended with these miniature gowns. And what makes these novel presentations exciting for me, at least, is their craftedness, which is a big contrast to how fashion is typically consumed in 2 dimensions on a screen these days. These sculpted offerings were created in response to a contemporary global tragedy, but they actually harken back to fashion's past of making 3-dimensional hand-rendered objects. So these whimsical presentations show us that, at least to some degree, fashion doesn't need people, or at least doesn't need the extensive commercial entourage of people feeding the multimedia hype machine of the fashion business. But if fashion doesn't need people in the same way, do people still need fashion? I mean, prior to the pandemic, the industry was already facing a lot of uncertainty. The shuttering of brick and mortar stores, including a large number of well-known and previously successful brands at every level. So that's suburban malls, stately department store flagships, to higher end designer retailers like Barney's, was seen as a mix of things, a casualty of online shopping, cheap fast fashion, a rising interest in resale, or typically the end result of an oversaturated market. So the retail apocalypse, or retail apocalypse, which is not easy to say, was already underway. And it was only really exacerbated by the pandemic. With nowhere to go and nothing to dress up for, people were simply buying less. For many of those with the ability to work from home, the move away from standard office attire or the need to be public facing meant a sharp turn towards more casual loungewear. Media commentary and reporting for months spent on, leggings, pajamas, caftans, sweatpants. It could be seen, in hindsight as, as freeing and depressing at the same time, or at least not even in hindsight at the time as well. So playful sort of journalistic accounts of extreme casual pandemic styles seem more like an attempt to kind of elevate spirits and find some common ground in some pretty trying and isolated times. The reality that people were losing jobs and couldn't afford new clothes, even if they had the occasion to wear them, was rarely mentioned in the same breath. Nor were the even more disturbing realities of manufacturing overseas. When buyers canceled billions of dollars worth of orders and supply chains ground to a halt as ever, it was the lowest paid workers at the fundamental level of fabrication that suffered the greatest. The same makers whose livelihoods were already precarious were either laid off or underpaid. Another instance of systemic problems already embedded in the industry being cast into much sharper relief with the pandemic. Optimistic forecasters see our present moment as a chance for reckoning with this system that is unsustainable ecologically, socially, or even creatively. At the highest of the high-end, designers for brands such as Gucci have already abandoned what they have described as the stale seasonal fashion calendar, and will now be presenting 2 collections a year instead of the previous 5. Ideally, removing the pressure to conform to an accelerating series of deadlines could inspire designers to even more innovative work. Wearing secondhand clothes is less stigmatized than ever, and multiple online platforms such as Depop, with their easy-to-use interface, have offered alternatives to things like Etsy or eBay. Slow fashion movements, an interest in buying less and buying better, meaning better quality materials, more sustainable fibers, has been accelerating for some time, and perhaps the forced slowdown of the pandemic has pressed some of us to further engage with and challenge these ideas. But one thing that really hasn't changed is fashion journalism's tendency to favor extremes. So post-pandemic fashion predictions tend to cluster really around 2 poles, fully embracing and extending the comfortable, casual ethos at one end, and on the other, a kind of full-blown fantasy of dressing up. Comparisons to the Roaring 20s abound, not only because our dates kind of conveniently line up, but now there is the added parallels with the aftermath of the Spanish flu. And I can't deny the appeal of wanting to break away from the past year and a half and kind of have some fun. And for a lot of us, clothing is a big part of that. And while dressing up in a creative, playful, and expressive way is something that I would love to see more of, it can have very little to do with what the industry is offering. Creative people will always find a way to be themselves, to be fabulous. So going back to this question of, do people need fashion? I would say absolutely yes. We experience the world as clothed bodies. Fashion is part of communication. As an unescapable social form, it can highlight individuality and diversity, as well as the potential to connect and express cultural allegiance. Maybe we just don't need the fashion that's advertised and sold to us through the obviously overextended and exploitative fashion system. For me, studying fashion has meant studying how clothes exist in the world as part of the wider visual culture. That this has necessarily meant finding fashion on the person in the street, or finding ways to see how that person might have understood their clothing in the past. So this takes me to my very final segue into thinking about new directions for fashion scholarship. New York has some of the best educational and cultural institutions with costume collections, and these were also placed on hold during the pandemic. Seeing students lose access to resources for making, but also archival collections, libraries, was just disheartening to watch. For those who study fashion's history, like my graduate students in Fashion, Textiles, and Museum Studies program at FIT, not being able to use primary sources like those presented some serious setbacks and demanded a reevaluation of how they conducted their work. It also raised questions about the nature of those collections themselves. What kinds of garments have historically been considered important enough to be preserved in them? So for someone like me who studies clothing worn by laborers or middle-class Americans in the everyday, those institutions never really offered much to begin with. And alternative sources, whether those are private collectors, vintage clothing dealers, and simply seeking the material out in the wild, flea markets or online, has underpinned my work for the past decade to such a degree that it would be really unrecognizable without it. And I'm not saying that all, future fashion historians need to follow similarly scattershot methods, but there are options outside of the museum. And when the pandemic forced them shut, it ought to have forced us to kind of perhaps reconsider our reliance upon those institutions and the old hierarchies that they continued to uphold, and perhaps to seek new research questions and seek answers and evidence from some other outlets. So I started this presentation with some dolls, some pretty exclusive dolls, but dolls nevertheless. And I think maybe that's kind of helpful. I think that we could extend upon this ideas of what the doll kind of embodies as an opportunity to play, to imagine, to create kind of new and different worlds, and maybe kind of carry that into a new way of making, consuming, and studying fashion that, ideally could find it more equitably present and relevant going into the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sonya. So from fashion, and thank you so much for that fascinating glimpse into pandemic fashion and also your methods, which changed. We're going to be pivoting to talking about labor, and specifically arts labor. So Kristin Perkins is Adult Programs Coordinator at the Millbrook Library. Her talk is called Who Stays and Who Goes? Diversity and Job Loss for Young Professionals. And she has published widely in a variety of publications and literary magazines, and is especially interested in arts labor questions, Mormon studies, and also queer theory. So thank you very much, Kristin.
Yeah, thank you. I am also sharing a screen. So, all right. Present. Okay. So first off, thanks everyone for coming today. Like Megan mentioned, I work as a program at a library, so I know that as days get warmer and CDC guidelines begin to lift, Zoom is sort of a less and less appealing option to spend an hour, so I appreciate you making it out. I'm going to be talking about job loss in the arts sector over the last year. This draws on a larger project of mine that I view as still ongoing, so like Michael, if you want to reach out, I'd be happy to talk to anybody more about this. I'll start by admitting a couple of personal investments. First, I do want to note my background is in theater, and the people I interviewed were also theater workers. That's my entry point, but together we can identify some of these larger trends. Secondly, I'll admit a deeply personal dimension to this work. I am a young arts professional in my later 20s. I graduated with my MA in Performances Public Practice in 2019. In the spring of 2020, I had a job, housing, health insurance, not in the arts sector, but adjacent. And I lost all that very quickly, was left unemployed, and I was hardly alone. So in April 2020, the effects of COVID-19, coupled with poor government leadership, pushed 14.7% of Americans into unemployment, the highest rate since the Great Depression. Not all industries were impacted equally, and a staggering number of arts workers, already hustling in precarious economies, were left without jobs. Conservative estimates wager the unemployment number for theater workers was around 30%, and that likely underrepresents the actual impact because of how many theater workers are employed simultaneously in other sectors. I'm drawing on interviews I conducted for two projects here. One, the Theater 19 Oral History Project, now housed at the Harry Ransom Center Archives, and two, interviews for an article I wrote for HowlRound. On Zoom and against backdrops of childhood bedrooms, I spoke to over 20 recent graduates and young professionals. Responses varied from interview to interview, but also within interviews, as young arts workers expressed optimism for the future alongside anger at unsustainable systems. I was particularly interested in how young professionals were reconfiguring their career trajectories and who was leaving altogether and why. Danielle Jacobson, a sound mixer who joined IATSE just 10 days before lockdown, said that she found tearful defenses of the arts on Facebook rang hollow between news stories of refrigerated trucks parked outside of hospitals as makeshift morgues. Frustrated by a perceived lack of efficacy, the break in her career also let her slow down enough to reflect. As she describes it, the pandemic basically made me get out of the mindset of the sunk cost fallacy. Because you could go, I spent 4 years in college and 3 years in the working world doing one thing. I should continue doing that thing because of what I put into it. And the pandemic made me realize that's not real. There's literally nothing stopping me from starting over. And to be clear, some young people are starting over. Danielle is taking a drastic left turn from sound design and going into medicine. She's not the only one thinking of medical school. Others are going into business school, swapping stage management for project management, or taking up urban planning. These are all fields I heard mentioned. Strangers to each other, Ali Hasselback, a stage manager, and Julia Borland, an actress and aerialist based in Chicago, are both training for realtor licenses. For those who did have to pivot quickly into new work, some are finding relief in reliable, fairly paid labor. Take Anthony Terry, who took a job at Costco. When I asked him what he thought about a future in theater, he responded, I'm constantly fluctuating on whether or not I want to go back after seeing what it's like to receive benefits and higher pay, even at a beginner level in retail. I'm not suggesting the field is people like Danny, Ali, Julia, and Anthony. And all of them might be happier and better off with full-time work elsewhere, given the abusive labor practices that can exist in arts fields. This is not a series of individual tragedies, and it's actually vitally important that we not frame it as such. If there is tragedy here, it is broader and deeper than one person or a handful leaving. An industry crisis does not affect everyone equally. Artists without access to intergenerational wealth, a demographic category informed by race in particular and sexuality marginally, as well as disabled artists, face additional barriers to remaining in the field in a time of scarcity. In the long run, and broadly speaking, the people most likely to ride out a wave of layoffs and a lack of jobs to eventually gain or regain full-time employment will be those with outside financial support. In the United States, intergenerational wealth is tied to whiteness. Black and Indigenous families have faced systemic racist policies that have prevented the accumulation of wealth, from job discrimination to redlining. On average, white families' collected income is 10 times higher than Black families, and white families are more likely than families of any other racial group to have dispersed assets that form a more secure safety net, a benefit in a precarious industry to begin with and essential in a crisis. Loss of diversity in the arts matters, not just because diversity is formulated as a value unto itself in our current discourse, but also for the vitality of the artistic landscape. If the class and intersecting demographic makeup of the industry impact the perspectives we perform, paint, sing, or stitch, these cultural products will continue to mostly reflect a status quo, occasionally aesthetically tweaked for another round of think pieces, but that is ultimately not challenging, illuminating, or community-oriented. I've darkly joked that as diverse theater artists can't find work and turn elsewhere, we might have more boring family dramas centered around grandpa's will in our future. This is tragic both for the tired tropes, but more significantly because of what these stories suggest about the industry's relevance, sustainability, and future audiences. Okay. So what can be done to support young arts workers and maintain diversity in our industries? Talking to other recent graduates and young professionals, I have a few suggestions, none of them new. None of them will be surprising, but to rehash them in context, here we go. The most obvious solution, those in positions of power should take a hard look at their budgets and allocate more to entry-level positions. In a moment of interlocking crises, the ideological commitments many arts companies made to anti-racist practice will mean little if not backed by material support for marginalized and entry-level artists. This means more than commissioning established artists and diversifying boards. It means paying lighting technicians, dressers, attendants, custodians, and yes, interns. It's not unreasonable to ask where this money will come from. not as a politically snide hypothetical, but as a real question. Certainly, some artistic and managing directors at large arts institutions have bloated salaries, but especially at mid-tier institutions, operating budgets are often already tight. For arts labor to be sustainable, we need government investment. We need more funding for the arts, in part for the arts to be a viable career path for those from working class backgrounds, artists of color, and disabled artists. Civic engagement can prompt some of this change, including voting, writing letters, marching, lobbying, and pressuring local, state, and federal governing bodies. One observable effect of the pandemic is the flight of young artists away from urban centers, sometimes moving back in with parents or with partners, or just moving for cheaper rent. I know this is a panel at a city university and we're all proud urbanites here, but may I suggest that the dispersion of young and diverse artists away from elite arts centers might be a good thing, not just for small towns and rural areas they are moving to, but also for the cities like New York that could seize an opportunity to move away from art with mass market appeal and towards community responsive art making, investing in neighborhoods and boroughs, resisting the gentrifying edge of art elitism, and responding to specific community needs and specific community conversations. So this presentation tries intentionally to be essentially materialist in its analysis of labor, partly to break the myth of arts exceptionalism and to position artists as workers. For that reason, my next suggestion might seem a little intangible, but it's also something that came up repeatedly as I was talking to young 20-somethings about their careers. That is the stigma around finding work outside of the arts sector. Jordan Nichols left the grind of professional acting behind for a career in sales. He told me that he felt like his fellow artists were always keeping tabs on each other, and if they don't make a living or pay their bills doing this art or acting, for example, then they're a failure. Oh man, that's a losing game though, because 9 out of 10 are not going to pay all their bills with just acting, and 0 out of 10 are going to do that during COVID. As Ella Mock said, there's this notion of if you're supposed to be here, you'll stick it out. If you're cut out for this line of work, you don't give in to your backup. I feel like that concept is really haunting me. We can do away with these haunts, with so much pressure to find success by making a living in the arts. Let's remind our students, our friends, and ourselves that we are making a living by breathing, pumping blood through our bodies, and finding joy in a poem or a cat video. We are making a living regardless of where we get our paychecks. It's a good reminder for any year. It's a vital reminder now. And for the sake of time, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristin. So from there, we'll be pivoting to the topic of large cultural institutions and how these institutions shift from a model of in-person attendance to a sort of virtual museum. Our last speaker is Nicholas Vincent, who's Director of Strategic Planning at the New York Botanical Garden. Prior to that, he spent 11 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a researcher in the American Wing and as manager of collections planning. Nick, I'll turn over the floor to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And let me just share my screen as well. Okay. So I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and thank you to my fellow panelists for your fascinating talks earlier. The pandemic has been a stress test for everyone, especially cultural institutions. For this talk, I'd like to look at some of the learnings from the New York Botanical Garden, my home institution. Specifically, I'll touch on 3 topics: the virtual museum, audience, and contingency planning. Now, I want to acknowledge that the pandemic has affected everyone differently, so my remarks today are specific to NYBG and are informed by my experience being on the reopening team there. First, a little background. NYBG's mission is to be an advocate for plants, which are the basis for all life on Earth. It was founded in the late 19th century, around the same time as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History. Like those venerable institutions, the New York Botanical Garden is a big, multifaceted organization. We're located in the Bronx on 250 acres of diverse terrain that supports 1 million plants. In addition to the living collections, there's a large botanical library, as well as educational programs for all ages and skill levels. We have art galleries. This is a shot from our current exhibition on Yayoi Kusama. A plant science research center and laboratory, and an herbarium, which is an archive of dried plant specimens. And to give you a sense of scale, our herbarium has 8 million specimens and counting. And of course, we have the requisite visitor amenities. This is a view of our main visitor center, where there's restaurants, shop, restrooms, etc. Now, prior to the pandemic, the garden was welcoming over 1 million visitors a year to our Bronx site. And like many other museums, a significant portion of our operating budget is supported by earned income directly related to in-person visitation. Things like tickets, retail, food and drink, and special events, everything from weddings to film shoots to wine tastings, which you see a picture of on the right. As we all know, in March of 2020, New York City effectively shut down and museums were closed to the public. So overnight, almost overnight, visitor experience became entirely virtual. My colleagues at NYBG quickly adapted to expand our digital presence and stay connected with our audiences. Everything had to pivot online: education, science, public programs. To give but one example, to date, my colleagues in adult education have transitioned over 800 courses and lectures online. As we've learned, digital platforms can often reach a wider audience. You're not limited by the size of your lecture hall. For example, a weekly science and humanities lecture series that was previously held in a space that could only accommodate a few dozen people, once converted to webinar format, is reaching new international audiences and is now attracting up to 1,000 participants. We've also noticed that digital content often has an afterlife. For example, content posted to NYBG's lecture library and YouTube channel continue to generate views. So overall, my colleagues have been keeping constituents engaged with a steady flow of new content: virtual tours, lectures, webinars, blog posts, social media activity, new publications, and research discoveries. Turning our attention to audience, I just want to touch on the topics of visitor experience and community engagement. In terms of visitor experience, the pandemic has forced people outside, and what a great time to be a botanical garden. We have 250 acres on which to spread out, get some fresh air, and physically distance. From the minute we reopened in July, we were pleasantly surprised by the number of people coming back to explore the garden. We had no programs at first, so it was a great chance for people to reconnect with the permanent collections. As we brought back public programs, my colleagues adapted to the new conditions and put as much outdoors as possible. They also reconfigured our programs and exhibitions for social distancing. For example, over the winter, we mounted a reconfigured members-only holiday train show. We also launched a new holiday light show, NYBG Glow, which was extremely popular. These and numerous other programs helped keep existing audiences engaged and attract new visitors. The big lesson learned here was lean into your conditions, don't fight them. In terms of community engagement, during the pandemic, our Bronx Green Up program coordinated a collective network of community gardens and farms to greatly increase the local production and distribution of fresh fruits and vegetables in order to help combat food insecurity that has been intensified by the pandemic. We also donated tons of fresh produce and vegetable starts, I mean, literally tons, thousands and thousands of pounds, grown on site in our teaching gardens and nurseries, several of which were repurposed for food production during the shutdown. And since reopening, we've expanded our existing community access programs by offering thousands of complimentary tickets to our Bronx neighbors and Bronx healthcare workers. We've also donated hundreds of potted plants to the doctors, nurses, and other essential employees at medical centers in the Bronx, where they've brought some much needed cheer to the facility's nursing stations. The last topic I want to touch on is contingency planning. No one was truly ready for the pandemic. Everyone had to adapt to this public health emergency and the constantly changing regulations. At NYBG, we created a steering committee to keep up with the latest guidance from public health officials and to ensure our policies were in line. This steering committee continues to meet regularly to review program proposals and to revise internal policies, protocols, and communications. And this interdepartmental team is highly collaborative, and it's been one of the most rewarding aspects of this otherwise extremely challenging experience. It's also worth noting that the state, New York State, has formalized contingency planning through the New York HERO Act. Officially titled the Health and Essential Rights Act, or HERO for short, this act requires employers to implement an airborne infectious disease exposure prevention plan. As a result, we should all be better prepared for the next pandemic. So to conclude, one big takeaway is that future disruptions are inevitable. I think all future planning will have a contingency planning component. It's no longer theoretical, we've lived it. We've learned how to wind down our operations and how to ramp them up again amid constantly fluctuating conditions. As a result, we're better prepared and hopefully stronger and more resilient than ever. Thank you.
Okay, great. So with this new digital programming series, we really wanted to stimulate, public discussion and debate. So, the most important part of this panel today is really hearing from the audience and the questions you have or the comments you may have. So you can drop a question in the chat. You can raise your hand. I can give you video and sound. Please bear with us. This is the first webinar we've done, but we'd love to hear from the audience, whether you have a question for one of the panelists, all of the panelists. Yeah. So if you have a comment or anything, you can put it, a comment or question, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Just going through the participants. Hi to all the students. I see some of my students in the audience and fellow faculty. Surely someone has something to say, because I know that many of the topics, whether the medical ethics, the vaccine, the anti-masking certainly hit close to home. Okay, so we have a question, and I can actually give him, hold on just one second. So Rick, do you want to just go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. This is for Michael. So great overview. Thank you for the presentation. I think you touched on most of the important ethical issues. But how about an opinion? Can you speak to the ethics of masks being required, the issue like now that people are getting vaccinated and they're loosening restrictions on masks, like what's the obligation versus autonomy? Same thing with vaccines, those are the juiciest issues for me right now.
Oh,
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I'm unmuting. Okay. I assume that's the end of the question.
Yes.
So I think, particularly in a country like ours, where personal autonomy is valued so highly, these are going to be the areas where you see the greatest amount of conflict at least the kind of conflict that shows up in the press and things like that. So you were asking an opinion. So I'm going to waffle a little bit. I think it depends on the particular issue. Generally speaking, the way in which these issues are tackled in a bioethical framework is through the lens of the harm principle. And the harm principle is a way of balancing off, the right of individuals to make autonomous choices in their own regard against, the needs of others. And the whole idea is that we allow as much personal autonomy as is consistent with avoiding serious harm to others. Now, the reason that's a waffle is because, of course, the questions, there are a lot of questions about harm and what constitutes harm. And, is when you offend somebody, is that a harm? Used to be that philosophers accepted that there was a distinction between a harm and an offense, but then what's hate speech? So hate speech is, it gives offense. Arguably, it can create a hostile climate, which can encourage violence against others and things like that. So that can be considered a harm. So it isn't always clear where to draw lines, but that's generally the kind of discussion that takes place around how much autonomy you can tolerate. Yeah. So you mentioned mask mandates, and just to finish the thought, actually, it's not just how we think of harm, but also, loss of personal autonomy is a harm as well. So, how much of a harm is it? Well, it depends on exactly what you're giving up in the way of your personal autonomy. Now, to take a kind of trivial example, a lot of philosophers will accept that if you reject a seatbelt, for example, because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, that's really a pretty trivial exercise of personal autonomy because it isn't in the name of anything people generally regard as significant in their lives, such as giving up your religion or giving up some deeply held belief about the way your life should go, or something that you greatly value. So a lot depends on what's being sacrificed in a restriction on somebody's personal autonomy. So masks, well, masks are inconvenient, but I think they sort of rank around seatbelt level. Yeah, they're inconvenient, but they're not really taking a great deal away from you, and they've been demonstrably effective in terms of restricting the spread of the virus. So I think that it's a pretty good no-brainer argument that that's a justified kind of intervention. And mask mandates, mask requirements, and usually they're imposed in such a way that someone who doesn't wish to respect a mask mandate can do so by not, for example, entering a store if a mask is required there or something like that. So, that's a good balance of personal autonomy and public protection. I think there are more serious concerns with vaccine refusal because, we generally have accepted the view that personal autonomy extends to the ability to reject unwanted bodily invasions. And obviously, the administration of a vaccine is a physical invasion. So, so at CUNY, right, we've required that all students who want to attend, at least in person, must be vaccinated. That's coercive. I mean, you can avoid it by not attending in person, but, a lot of students, no doubt, will want to attend in person. And probably amongst those, some of them are going to be at least vaccine hesitant, if not vaccine refusers or anti-vaxxers or whatever, and some for reasons of not wanting to have that substance in their system. So, that's a more serious compromise of personal autonomy. You want a personal view on I still think that we'll never get to herd immunity if we don't, achieve a very serious level of vaccination compliance. I'd certainly upwards above 70%, I would think. So, maybe, it's not one measure, like having the military go around and vaccinate everybody, that might be too much of an assault on personal liberty, too much of a compromise of personal autonomy. But coercive measures, rewarding people for complying with the vaccine requirements, or mandating it if they want to engage in certain kinds of activities like going to school and so forth. We have this already. In fact, in many places, including CUNY, if you want to attend CUNY, you have to demonstrate that you've been vaccinated against a whole host of communicable diseases. So, I would generally argue on the side of public health and public protection in those kinds of situations. I don't think the surrender of personal liberty is commensurate with the gains that you're making at a public level. So that would be my general response to those kinds of examples.
Right. To add from
Thank
the chat, Rich Legum, another one of our philosophers, said, according to some experts at Johns Hopkins, we've already reached herd immunity. And sorry, Rick, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, thank you. That was a very comprehensive, thoughtful answer. And I think I agree with everything that you said. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's rare that we always agree, or that we agree on things.
Yeah.
All things, I should say. We agree on lots of things, but not all things.
Well, I'll add one more little thing to complement what you said, with the seatbelt, like the motorcycle helmets and seatbelts and stuff like that are paternalistic invasions of autonomy. But I believe that empirically it's shown that in the course of an accident, if someone has a seatbelt on or a helmet on, there's less damage that's likely to happen to others because they will retain somewhat more control over their vehicles if they have these protections in place. So there's the harm, there's the indirect harm to others, or the potential of harm for others.
Yeah, I'm unaware of that as a finding. I would. I think I need some convincing on that, but it's certainly plausible.
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure about the helmets, but I've heard the argument made that studies have shown that accidents that occur with seatbelts on, generally, the collateral damage is less because the driver at least has more control over the vehicle if they haven't gone flying out of it. Based on an impact, but this might not really be. It might have just been anecdotal. I don't remember seeing the study, but I heard about it from a reliable source, so I just kind of accepted it. Not necessarily a good policy, but
well, if you find it, definitely let me know, because seatbelts and motorcycle helmets are something that I discuss with my students when we talk about the issue of autonomy. So I'd be very interested to see what you might have.
Yeah. I remember who told me that. A good friend of mine made that argument to me. So I'm going to ask him for the data. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from Rich Legum. Rich, you can go ahead and ask it yourself, or raise the issue yourself.
Michael, a lot of things. I mean, I don't disagree with you about many of the principles. But it's quite interesting, and it's certainly something that I find that many of our, I'm trying to actually enable myself to be seen, but.
Oh yeah, let me do that for you. Go ahead right there. Oops.
But well, doesn't seem to be. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, that's too bad, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that the risk of vaccination for young children, certainly children who haven't even been, they haven't even done testing on.
Uh-oh.
So now I'm popping in. Okay.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Okay. Is significantly less than that from the flu. Are you in favor of mandating flu shots as well?
So wait a minute. So you're saying the risk from COVID vaccines is less for children than the risk from a flu vaccine?
No. The risk of COVID-19.
Oh, for a child.
For children that age, without question, is lower than that for the common flu.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure about the whether I accept that claim or not.
As I said, there are empirical claims that
Yeah.
are flying around that
Yeah.
are the basis of all the disagreement about.
But again, I think, and you're talking about a very complicated situation where we're talking about the rights of parents to make choices for their children. And that touches on all sorts of things, including religious liberties and so forth. So I think, there's
I'll
no,
even set all of those aside. I'm still worried about they are not an at-risk population.
right, but
And they haven't, and there's been virtually no, or certainly no significant amount of transmission ever identified to children below 6.
right, but the
And they're
argument,
and as you and I are both aware, or maybe I'm more aware than you are because of the proximity of my grandchildren, they communicate a lot of diseases to
yeah, Rich, you have to apologize. I have to apologize. Rich knows that my grandchildren are on the West Coast, so this is totally academic for me, whereas it's personally significant for him. Yeah, I think the argument for vaccinating children is not just a question of their health. It's also, what's the impact in terms of achieving herd immunity? And children have also been a major vector in terms of spread of the disease, because they're asymptomatic. So you don't know they have it. And then they, and then as a result, people don't limit their exposure. So, I think that, the effort to vaccinate children can be justified on the grounds of trying to, again, achieve as much herd immunity as we possibly can. I think it's also extremely important to remember that this is a rather unusual virus, and it mutates rather quickly and in ways that are quite alarming. And the possibility, and a lot of epidemiologists and researchers have stressed this, the possibility exists that we might find, if we don't achieve, if it continues to circulate, we could well find ourselves facing a new strain, which is totally vaccine resistant, and we would then be back to square one again, which I think would be a public health disaster by most people's account. So I think that's the kind of thing we would weigh in terms of intervention in the rights of parents to refuse vaccines, which would not arise with the flu. The flu, while it is indeed a risk, is not that kind of public health risk that COVID-19 really is. So I think that would be the answer.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Other questions, other comments, suggestions for the follow-up panel?
I have a question for Nicholas, if I may. I found your talk really fascinating, partly because I'm involved in a local land trust here, actually two, the Westchester Land Trust and the Somers Land Trust where I live. And, we have a fair amount of property, and we saw a huge uptick in visitors and things like that. I was, we were actually stressed in terms of managing the visitations and so forth, as were, I know the Catskill Parks and the Adirondack Parks and every other open space that's out there. So I actually had two questions. One was how you guys managed. Did you see crowds and crowds, and did you limit access in order to prevent overpopulation? It's only 250 acres, which is big, but it's not. It's big in the context of New York City, but it's not overwhelmingly big. The other thing, do you have any suggestions for arts organizations that don't have that kind of wherewithal to keep bringing people in, keep their public engaged, because they don't have those kinds of outdoor spaces that they can utilize?
So thank you. Yeah, the first question on the crowd restrictions, we had no choice. All arts and cultural institutions fell under the New York Forward guidelines. They had indoor and outdoor museum venues. And when we first opened in July, I believe the capacities for outdoors were 33% and for indoors was 25%. The New York Botanical Garden is unusual because we kind of hit every category possible under the New York Forward reopening guidelines. We have education, we have day camps, we have food service. So we were navigating about 12 different industry guidelines, that didn't always align. So yes, we restricted tickets, and we still have advanced ticket registration, and we still have put some capacities in to ensure that we can give people the space to distance. And I think that we were well positioned and have been fortunate that there's been a lot of interest in getting outdoors and in gardening. To be honest, we've had occasional days where we were sold out. We were at capacity, again, at the restricted capacity that was set by New York's reopening guidelines. The other question, advice for other institutions, I think you saw, I want to be careful not to speak on behalf of other institutions that I don't know about firsthand, but everyone had to pivot online and make more engagement. And I think that will be a great thing for everyone. That investment in some organizations that I'm involved with and that I support have a more robust, digital offering now and engagement than ever before. And I have to imagine that will continue. So I think if we try to look for benefits, that's one of them, is forcing everyone to think about new ways to engage with their publics. And in our case, I made the one example, but we really, our science and humanities lectures and other programs hit huge international audiences that could never make it to the Bronx, in person for a talk. So that was a great way to reach new audiences, and I'm hopeful it will continue.
Yeah, great. I think at CUNY that's been similar, in that it's helped students to rethink which learning modality serves them best, whether it's online or hybrid or in person. And, digital events, digital book talks, digital things like this are not necessarily a bad thing at all, especially when we're at home isolated. Other comments or questions, issues from the audience? Just make sure I'm getting everything in the chat. Any hands up? Let's see. Yes. Okay. Sorry, just one second. Our chief of IT is not here, but I'll thank him anyway. Asif Hussein has been amazing in making this possible. Sorry. Oh, okay. Rich. Sorry. Go ahead, Rich. Go ahead.
Okay, I just have a question about the fashion question. I'm curious, that is, you certainly have mentioned some of the trends and what's happened. I'm wondering if you think this is going to be good or bad or a significant force in the long run in the fashion industry.
Well, it would kind of depend on how you define good or bad. If good for a fast fashion manufacturer is about like just moving quantity and selling a lot of cheap products and making money that way, that has kind of slowed down. What I think is good would be taking a step away from some of the trends and models that had existed in the industry for a long time that were already not so sustainable. So I think what would be good is maybe slowing down the pace of production, consuming less in general, or consuming, buying less and buying better, which people in the field have been talking about for some time, but it's actually not maybe needing to buy things or going out is hopefully gonna get some more of the public on board with that. I don't think a lot of the businesses, the really big businesses, would ever lose money because they would just kind of pivot the way they make things. And hopefully that would be a bit more equitable. So, it's gonna take a while to see how it really plays out. But with manufacture overseas shutting down as quickly and as drastically as it did, there's still ramifications for that, just for getting materials and textiles and having that kind of access. So maybe it doesn't have to escalate to the way it was.
There's a great question in the audience. Thomas Finnegan for Kristin. Thomas, do you want to go ahead and ask her that question? Thomas?
I can also just read it and respond if
Oh,
that's
okay,
easier.
okay, sure. So there's a question in case you don't see the chat for Kristin. Does massive job loss in the arts field spell a major success for the corporate world, or can it be turned into a revolution for the arts world?
So thanks, Tom. And I think I understand the question, but please correct me if I get this sort of wrong. But so there's this blurry line in between sort of like these big professional arts companies that have been able to, that are not in any danger of disappearing. But you do see these smaller companies, and again, I'm gonna sort of lean on my theater background, but these smaller and even mid-tier companies that are either seriously suffering or have disappeared during the pandemic. So while Broadway can sort of herald its reopening as this grand gesture of like hope in the future, you see these smaller companies that are, it's going to take years for them to pop back up again. That said, I don't want to be like entirely cynical about what this means. It's why I sort of want to emphasize that a dispersal of artists into communities can be a really good thing, shaping arts culture in rural areas and small towns and smaller cities, and signaling to bigger cities the necessity of them responding to community conversations and being community resources. And I do think, like Nicholas has said and other people have brought up, the ways that arts organizations have had to pivot to respond to the difficulties of this time have also opened up possibilities for the future in terms of digital programming. Certainly digital theater became a thing, although is that oxymoronic? We could talk about that later, Tom. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity right now. I do seriously worry about the small and mid-tier arts institutions that we lost during this time and how it affects young workers in particular. Does that work as an answer? Thanks, Tom.
Great question, yeah. Other questions, comments, observations? Our department chair, Jacob Siegel, is here. I wanted to thank him for his support and interest in this. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Jacob, but Jacob is here.
Sure. Can you hear me? I wanted to say thank Megan and the people who worked with her for putting this event together. I think it's been very valuable as we think about the future of New York, and I'm looking forward to future sessions as we, this common concern of ours, what's going to happen to New York and to CUNY into the future, which obviously is a big unknown, but panels like this will help shed some light on it. So thanks again, Megan, for organizing this and for the panelists for coming.
Oh yeah. No, I wanted to really thank Asif, our IT head, who made this possible, as well as the president's office, who graciously lent us their Zoom account. So if there are no further questions, I think we'll wrap up at 4:15 to not keep everyone much past the hour 15-minute mark. But thank you all so much, and just email if you have any suggestions for the follow-up panel. Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks.